Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this series on founder mental health and well-being. My name is Dr. Mary Meduna Gross. I'm the founder of Plena Vita Executive Coaching. And I'm thrilled with every guest that I have because they're all wonderful. And Chris is no exception to this. Chris, first of all, thank you for being here.
Oh, this is delightful. Thanks for inviting me. Appreciate
This is
it.
going to be a lot of fun having this conversation. So let me tell you a little bit about Chris and some of the things that I really admire about Chris. And I think that one of the things that really stands out to me is that Chris is a person that literally talks about the future requiring a new kind of leader, right? I think a lot of times what we're trying to do is reshape what we've been doing rather than just Buckminster Fuller, right? Just build the new. And so Chris is about supporting that new kind of leader, a leader who can focus attention on what matters most, handle stress under pressure, and make grounded decisions and set the team mood. She works with C-suite small business owners and entrepreneurs committed to a new way of doing business. Sustainability and legacy aren't just buzzwords for her, but are commitments to bringing real value to the marketplace that sets you apart. Once again, thank you so much for being here, Chris.
Thank you. That was just a lovely little intro. I appreciate that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, so you and I have had a chance to get to know one another and work together. We're both involved with conscious capitalism here in Chicago. And so that's kind of our context of being together. And so I've gotten to know you through that. And so I would like you to share your story about being a founder, a business owner. What was working for you? What was not working for you? And how did you get to where you are now?
Yeah, I could tell a short and a long version. Maybe I'll go for the middle. So when I grew up, both of my parents were entrepreneurs. They both had their own businesses. They were active in the community. It was a lot about giving back. It was about making sure you vote. It was about participating. It was about being the best you could be. So those lessons were inculcated in me really, really early. Fast forward, I kind of knew early on and then acted on it that I would be a psychologist. It was one of those weird child things, like, I think I'll be this when I grow up. And there I was. So I went to school, did all that sort of thing, and was actively working as initially as a social worker. Then I got my doctoral degree later. But as a social worker, I was working in the community and was working with a lot of community businesses and was really intrigued by how they were not only doing their work in their business. A number of them would be big names if I shared them with you today. And yet how they were grappling with what we would today call employee health and well-being. We didn't call it that then, but that's what it was. And I was really, really taken by working with these businesses to do great work and the impact that business could have on what we were up to. Not too long after that, late in my 20s, early 30s, there was some pretty severe trauma in my family. And when that happened, didn't happen to me directly, but it affected me and my mental health at the time. I really pivoted and I turned toward a trauma focus. And so for the next probably 20 years, much of my work was focused on recovering from my own trauma, the relational trauma of my sister's event that happened, and the impact that rippled through all of us, and then the clients that I would serve in the community. And of course, trauma is non-discriminatory and affects many, many. Big T trauma, not everybody. Little T trauma, for sure. And so I ended up seeing and working with lots of business people who were struggling not only with business, but how to make sense of what their own shaping had been early in life, including a lot of trauma. And so that can manifest in lots of ways. And then I had a trauma of my own in terms of a difficult divorce situation that really caused me to question everything. And in that process of questioning everything, it was all up for grabs anyway. Might as well really explore something new. I decided to do a deep dive into the study of somatics. I was already trained as a mindfulness educator, and really doing a deep dive into what does it mean to live fully in my body as a human, and what impact would that have if I'm mindfully aware of that? How does it affect my business, my practice, as well as the work I'm doing with clients? So that's kind of that's how I got here today. And along the way, in terms of training, I also went on to get some coaching training, et cetera. So what I do most of the time today is really work with executives and their teams, and leaders who really want to make a difference. And so that kind of sums it up. How's that?
Yeah,
Gives you a sense?
Yeah. So there's things I want to dig in here.
Okay, go.
So the big T word, right? Trauma. I think that I lived most of my life denying that I had trauma, right? It's just something that happened, right? And for me, it was adoption, right? So for adoption, I was supposed to be happy about it. I was supposed to be grateful that I had this experience. And that was not my internal experience at all, right?
Yikes. Okay.
Yeah, right. And so there's a lot of stories that I created about myself at a very young age about who I was because of this. And I think that when I look at the statistics around trauma, particularly childhood trauma in entrepreneurs, there's a high correlation.
It's really high.
It is. And so one of the reasons I'm doing this series is I want just to bring normalization, bring awareness that there's a high percentage of us who have experienced trauma.
Yeah, for sure.
And I know my own story when I was in that trauma phase, like I felt like a victim all of the time. It didn't matter what anybody or anything was doing to, with, or for me. I always felt like a victim. It was never working out quite right. And I think, and I see other people kind of getting stuck in those same trauma stories.
Yeah, that happens. I mean, we get stuck in them all the time. And today versus when I first came on the field, if you will, as a young psychotherapist, trauma, especially sexual abuse trauma, but it was like 1 in a million. I mean, I'm not even joking at that number. And there was such a kind of collective denial about the realities. And then that also included physical abuse, because that's just how people parented. And what we fundamentally know today, you fast forward, there's a lot of trauma-informed work. And what we're seeing, I love that you're exploring this with entrepreneurs, because entrepreneurs have this kind of amazing, wonderful will to live by God. And we're going to do it. And we're going to make shit happen, pardon my French. And yet what can happen with that is it can really get overcooked, and we can, we're trying to overcompensate. And if those kind of patterns that got set up early in life aren't addressed, there's a lot of negative mischief that can happen in business as a result. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of how you've seen trauma influencing business outcomes?
Oh, golly. Let me see which one I could pick. I have a gentleman who struggles with depression and bipolar, a diagnosis. It's a diagnosis, so it's not him, but he struggles with that. He's highly successful and in his industry, and that's really great. But at one point, he had an episode that he didn't want to admit, started to ramp up in terms of a bit of mania, and then it got more extreme. And when that happens to the person who's experiencing it, it can feel really expansive and wonderful. And yet the flight of ideas is pretty intense, and other people couldn't track and follow him. And so it had a very kind of constricting effect on his business for a time, until he got the help he needed, and then he could settle out. So that would be one example. I've seen mental health kind of concerns show up where there's a real inability to communicate effectively, because I'm the boss, especially entrepreneurs. I'm the boss and you should just follow what I say. So very on the worst end of it, kind of dictatorial. I know one of the gentlemen that I wrote about in my book, a client of mine for a few years, was a Vietnam vet.
Mhm.
And so he was of that age. But when he came back, he started this business in his garage, kind of like a Michael Dell story. And he really had it grow and it went really well, except that when this was exacerbated because he was like 6'5" and like a hunk, but he had a really deep voice and he would talk down to people like he did when he was in Vietnam. Because in Vietnam, he needed to do that. He was in a different context, but he comes back here and he's shouting at people and he's really loud. And people were just frightened of him. And so the impact, there was a real disconnect on his ability to connect with his people, even though the reality was, as we uncovered it, this guy had a heart of gold. And he was all about taking care of people, right? Which is why his experience in Vietnam manifests this way. And we had to really unpack and help him connect the dots so that he could get he could create a different way to hold those dots together in a different narrative that could work so that people actually knew he cared. So that would be another way. So those are just two. I could probably come up with a whole bunch more.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing those. Obviously, those are pretty common experiences. I think, just kind of how we get stuck and how that impacts what we're trying to accomplish. Another thing that was coming up for me as you were talking about, I just kept hearing people pleaser, right? This is in the back of my mind. And I know that's also a trauma response, right? Is to be a people pleaser. And I've had countless clients, and I've heard CEOs talking from the stage about being a people pleaser. And in some of the cases that I've seen, that I'm aware of, what happens then is I don't either develop the people that I have because they're not living up to my standards. So either I don't develop them or I don't let them go because I don't want to, I don't want to take away their money, right? I don't want this to impact them. And so we feel stuck. Like I've got this team member that is not working for me, is not right for my business, and yet I can't make a decision to let them go.
Yeah. Well, and that fits in really nicely with what we call the founder's trap, right? Because like I can't let go of anything because I started this business. And so even though I have you as a team member who isn't functioning very well, not only do I want to please, but I can't bear to let you go. So I just get in there and I micromanage and I overstep. And then we have all kinds of mischief in communications, in processes, and actually executing to get the respective work done, all of it, right? Yeah. It kind of can create a mess.
Yes, it does. And then we wonder where this mess is coming from, right? We feel like it's happening to us rather than recognizing that it's a combination of what's happening and our reaction to what's happening.
That's exactly right. Yes, for sure.
Yeah. So when I think about this, I hear this from a space that we're really in survival mode a lot of times.
A lot of times, yes.
Most of the time. Until we can intentionally move ourselves out of survival mode.
Yeah.
Let me ask you something.
Okay.
When someone's in survival mode, right? And we kind of talked about how we kind of deny really how intense that survival mode might be. What do you think might help someone who is stuck in that mode see another possibility?
That's a great question, and it could be multi-layered because some of that survival mode stuff is so embodied in our tissue, quite literally, and in our habits that we literally cannot see them. So we might be really smart people, in terms of IQ and all of that. But if I am not self-aware about, I'm kind of getting in my own way here, I'm not going to see it. And so if you're working with that person, or I might be, one of the very first things I'm going to do, in addition to having people pause, which I'll talk about in a second, is really an extension of the pause. I want people to turn in and notice, what's going on when you're stuck? Who's around besides you? How are you feeling? And what is your impulse to do? Or can you just kind of hang out here and start to notice? That sounds very rudimentary. And on the one hand, it is. And it's highly sophisticated on the other, because it is so important to do. If we don't have that kind of self-awareness, and there's a lot of research and all kinds of things being taught around EQ, emotional intelligence, but this is the first step in emotional intelligence. And if we don't go there, and if we aren't willing to look at how I'm getting in my own way, then we're really at the mercy of old habits that started long ago for really good reason that are just now, they're worn out, or they're overly taxed, or there's not enough choice, right? So that first step is really, really key to getting started. Yeah. And a lot of times, especially for professionals in business, certainly for entrepreneurs, it takes something going wrong before like they kind of like crack up or hit a wall or do whatever in order to like, oh, I really have, or a marriage goes sour, or I'm never home with my kids, or there's some financial thing I didn't take care of. It can take that for people to wake up. So better to do it on the side of I have more awareness, I'm in choice, I don't have to have the catastrophe happen.
Right.
But sometimes it takes that.
It does. It took lots of catastrophes for me.
Did it? Yeah.
Multiple over a period of years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Before
and they stink. They totally stink. They totally do. Mm-hmm. And yet they're the way through. You know, one of the things I talk about is that the triggers that we have, the catastrophes that we create, that we don't think we create, we think it's out there, but really it's kind of in here too. That's the portal through which we can become more awake and present to whatever's going on. So the triggers are great. And I tell people to embrace them, and everybody thinks I'm nuts, and I get it.
Right? Yes. Yes, I definitely agree with you on the trigger. And I do want to come back to that. But before we go there, I just want to close this loop on this piece about, how do we get out of that stuckness to begin with? And one of the things that I've noticed from my own experience and working with my clients is that I think when we're in that stuckness, I'll speak from my own perspective. I was waiting for somebody or something outside of me to rescue me.
Common response.
Right? Yeah, I thought surely first of all, I saw my pain is outside of me to begin with, right? Is because something happened to me, whether it was my original wounding or whatever was happening today, right? Whatever that wounding is, right? So if I see the problem is outside of me, then I'm also going to want to find the solution outside of me.
Correct.
And to me, that is the pain of that cycle, is that we just keep looking outside. We keep looking outside and until we finally come to ourselves and just say, I'm done with this.
Yeah.
I had a moment of that. I had a lot of medical issues the spring and summer, and I was struggling. And I had one of those opportunities where there were 2 invitations in a row one night, where I was doing a breath work event, and I'm walking around the space before I do it. And there was a table that says, what are you ready to let go of? And I thought, oh, I'm ready to let go of struggling. Right? Okay, that's what I'm going to do for this breath work that I'm doing. So of course, within the breath work, what are you ready to let go of? I thought, oh, I know the answer to this. I'm ready to let go of struggling. And the next thing that I hear in my own head was, Mary, what if you're just struggling because that's all you know how to do?
Oh, it's a habit.
It's a habit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so for the rest of that breath work, I really got to look at, well, what would I do instead? Who would I be if I wasn't struggling?
That's right. That's totally right.
And just trying that on and playing with that and seeing what it felt like to walk around in that skin for 20 minutes.
Right? Sure. Absolutely.
But it's that point of, am I ready to let go of this? And am I done struggling? Right. It took another health issue for me to get to that point.
And well, there you go.
There's going to be layers that are going to, I'm still going to miss it and it's going to come back. But the point is that we come back and make that decision, that commitment. So now we know I'm done struggling. We're going to build some self-awareness. And I think the pause is also one of these early tools that take us through the rest of this journey. So will you talk a little bit about what you know about the pause and kind of, how do we do this?
Yeah. Could I tell a story and then lead into the pause? Could I do that?
I love that.
Okay. So I told you that I worked in communities I was the director of an employee resource center, which was like a employee wellness. And at the time, I had been hired by a big bank in Chicago to do a series of stress management workshops and in service kinds of things. And so it's August. I'm preparing. It's hot in Chicago. I'm getting ready to anticipate going down to the bank to do this series. And I get this really bad rash on my legs, and it's itchy and red and gross. And I think it's my laundry detergent. I think it's some new clothes or sheets or something. And so I finally can't stand it. It's waking me up at night, and my skin is kind of raw. I go to the doctor, which I don't love doing, but I will go. She runs some allergy tests. They come back and she says, well, the good news is that you are not allergic to anything. And you have a severe case of contact dermatitis, and we can address that with some medication. However, my diagnosis of you, now remember, I'm going to teach a stress management class downtown at this big bank. And she said, my diagnosis for you is chronic stress. And you need to go and take a stress management class. And I was so irritated at her because the audacity that she would have to call me out and say, you are more stressed than you think. But parents are entrepreneurs. I'm an entrepreneur, pretty hard driving, ambitious. I'm not stressed. I'm really not. Right?
This is normal.
This is normal. So I take that and I'm irritated. And around that time, I also discovered the work of John Kabat-Zinn, who's a mindfulness teacher. And he talked about engaging and working with stress, not in the typical cognitive way, which is what I was prepared to teach, which isn't bad. It's just not as complete. He talks about pausing to be with these symptoms, pausing to be with the agita that I was experiencing with the doctor. And so I decided, I used the opportunity. I didn't realize it at the time, but I used the opportunity, like, I'm going to actually bring this to the folks. I'll teach them this, but let's do some mindfulness practice. And I was a newbie at that, but it started my career as a mindfulness educator too, and leads to this very simple truth, to get back to the pause, that the pause is a momentary interruption, of whatever we're doing. It could be an activity. It could be a mental loop, like I'm keeping looping this way of thinking. It could be the interruption of a mood state. It could be your experience of saying, what am I ready to give up? I'm going to pause. And oh, by the way, I'm ready to give up suffering and struggling, right? So the pause can be just that, a little moment. It could be so momentary. It could be a daily pause where you take on a practice of mindfulness to bring our attention fully to, okay, here I am living in the world, in a body, in this space, in my life. What's going on? It could be a weekly practice where you nourish yourself. So pauses come in lots of sizes and shapes, and it is highly undervalued as a really effective tool, practice to engage in. And a lot of times in our culture today, people don't want to pause because I have too much to do. We're too busy. I can't possibly stop. I've got momentum. And all of that is BS. Right. It's just all BS, because if we're breathing, we have the capacity to learn to pause.
Yeah. Well, and I see those stories, and I've used those stories myself, right? I see those stories as ways to maintain that survival way of operations, right? Because we feel like we need to for survival, right?
That's right.
It's a very closed, very efficient loop.
It is totally.
But I guess then again, I have to decide, do I want to be in survival mode all of the time?
Right.
Or do I want to explore the possibility? Because when you're in survival mode, I don't think it's possible to really imagine life of ease, of life of joy.
You might have a fleeting glance at it, but it seems impossible. And part of it, it's not just that I don't have the willpower, because willpower is way overrated.
Yep.
It's not even just that I have a choice, although we do. It's that neurobiologically, these loops have been set in place and they're hard to break out of. Think of driving in Chicago in the grooves and the ruts and the potholes. It's kind of like that, only it's in our internal body brain. And so breaking out of it, the pause helps us to get a little bit of clarity. And if we keep pausing and keep pausing, we get more and more clarity. And then we can say, oh, I write about this too. I'm catching myself. I'm doing that thing that I always do that gets in the way of where I want to go. So I'm actually going to maybe I'll slow down just a little bit more so I can have an alternative. So it's not like for lack of wanting. It's more like realizing the biology of what goes on for us, and that's real, and respecting it enough to slow down, because most of us tend to override it and just like shoot for where we're going, or we're very attached to our ways of thinking, because we all are. It's part of being human.
It's part of being human again. And when we're in that survival mode, it literally is about survival.
Absolutely.
And so no wonder we cling to these.
Yeah.
There's really no wonder why we would do that. But I think that's then when having a simple, not easy necessarily, but a simple practice to start to play with, right? Because I think that's the other thing that I know that I'm guilty of is I'm going to go from 0 to 60 in about 1.1 seconds, right? Oh, pausing? I'm supposed to be pausing. Great. Why am I not pausing all the time now? Right? Now I'm going to judge myself because I'm not doing it right.
Yeah, exactly. But when we're on hyper speed, or when we're caught up, when we're stressed, everything contracts, right? So our biology contracts, our muscles contract. Imagine like driving down the road and a car is veering toward you and you jump. Well, you imagine jumping like that over time, over the lifetime. Now, pretty soon I'm chronically tense. So a pause isn't just to stop, although it is that, it's pausing, but it's like, can I allow myself to relax the musculature? Can I let my hands unclench? Can I allow my mouth to just relax a little bit even? That kind of awareness and the ability to let that happen can shift everything. It doesn't have to be a big, bold, I have to change my whole life. It could be, in fact, it usually is, it's like, oh, it's this awareness. I could have a little bit more of that. So a question I often ask myself and others is, and it goes along with your struggling question, what would happen if I had a little more ease in my body right now, or in my mind right now? Or what would happen if there's a little ease and a little more spaciousness in my feeling self? There's more room there, just even with the question, let alone like settling in.
Yeah, that curiosity piece.
Totally.
I think that is also underrated, the value of curiosity.
I think that's right.
Because if I'm not curious, then I'm simply accepting that whatever I'm aware of now in this moment is all there is.
Yeah, and if it's all there is, and to talk about what you mentioned earlier, a little bit about leaders today, the stakes today in navigating the world that we live in are increasingly high. They demand the complexities demand that we be agile and adaptive. And if I'm all constricted and like armored up, I'm not adaptive at all. I'm like tight as a drum. And then all kinds of physical health issues start to happen because literally my tissues aren't getting enough blood and oxygen. Right. So, yeah. So it's actually imperative, I think, for leaders today. That new way of doing business starts with a new way of leading. And the new way of leading starts with, I have to be self-aware.
I love that.
Leaders go first, starts with us.
It really does. And again, it's
really
that
does.
Stop looking for, somebody or something else to fix this and make me feel better inside. Just
Yeah.
let's just start to feel better inside first of all, and it's going to be uncomfortable, it's going to be messy,
Mhm.
but that's part of the process.
It's part of the process of unwinding ourselves. We get wound up tight, and it's like, how do we unwind? And what we start to notice, and that this is so true. Recently, I went through a really difficult month with lots of personal loss. And so I could feel myself like starting to shut down a little and hold back a little. And as I like, okay, this is it. I don't have to overreact. I can just feel the feelings that I'm having of sadness or difficulty, both. I could start to feel not only my body relax, but then my mind started. I could choose to let go a little bit, like this isn't forever. I could do some positive kind of self-compassion and self-soothing. And I've been finding a lot more energy as a result. Because that's the other thing is, chronic stress is an energy drain.
Yeah.
And we are just not wired to run on empty all the time. And we're wired for renewal and rest. And then we get out there and go, and then we do it again. And many of us just override that
Yeah.
chronically.
We
Yeah.
do. And I'm thinking about the history, right? So if we're talking about a new kind of leader,
Yeah.
what kind of leader have we come from? And I usually define it as a command and control style leadership,
Mm-hmm.
what we're emerging out of. And one of the ways that I heard this described is that a lot of this command and control leadership style was really, say, perfected in World War I and World War II.
In the
And
military. Mm-hmm.
right. And then
Yeah.
when those people came back, they were running businesses, and they're running businesses, as you were talking about your Vietnam veteran, the
Mm-hmm.
same way they were running their units
Exactly.
in wartime,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the context
Right.
is also different. That is a survival
Yes.
context.
Of necessity. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
right.
Mm-hmm.
But this command and control style of leadership keeps us in that state of chronic stress. And so
Yeah.
when I hear you talk about a new kind of leader with compassion and self care,
Mm-hmm.
that again does not really jive with that command and control vision, right? If we're identifying what this is what it means to be a leader, this soft version of this just seems too soft. Can't get anything done. Because again, those beliefs that the only way to get stuff done is to dominate, to direct, and to,
Yeah.
micromanage.
Well, and so yeah, to your point, the context in Vietnam or in Afghanistan or in any war zone, command and control is really important to keep people safe and out of harm's way. And it is not appropriate necessarily when we come back to business as usual. And so while there is increased complexity and chaos, it's probably not that, although it can feel like that if we're all tight. So yeah, there's a range of different leadership styles. So how do we actually have enough wherewithal to know, let alone to lead with what's required here
Yeah.
versus here versus here? And so our capacity as leaders, we have to expand our repertoire, because at different points in time with different people or different teams, we'll have to take different kinds of actions. But if we're only like dialed into one, that's not going to work very well, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. We don't have options.
Right. There are no options if it's just one, for sure.
Yeah, right. So if you're stuck in that survival mode, those are the options that you have. As we said earlier, you don't even see the other options. But if you're
Correct.
able to function from this new perspective, I think conscious leadership would call it above the line
Mm-hmm.
um,
Yeah.
way of
Mm-hmm.
being, then you can go below the line if and when you need to. There's no judgment on that, but again, it brings that self-awareness piece.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I feel my need to come below the line for some defense mechanism or survival piece, then absolutely
Mm-hmm.
go ahead. Right, as you were saying,
Mm-hmm.
discern according to the situation that one's in. But under normal circumstances, we should be able to connect with one another, collaborate with one another, and really,
Mm-hmm.
this is what to me was the magic of leadership is imagining everyone's gifts coming together, and because they're together they're more impactful, right? There's this compounding effect of those gifts.
Yeah.
But if we've got a leader who is in survival mode, these gifts are not going to be recognized or really given an opportunity to bloom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, the pandemic put a real fine point on the way that we work and the different styles of leadership. And it put a fine point on paying attention, not like people weren't, but now they really are, in terms of paying attention to employees and their well being. And so being able to realize all the people who work for me have families that they go to. They need to be able to show up fully for them. I hold that as a deep value. And so if I hold that as a deep value, what's the best way to support them in their gifts? And, it's sometimes, and having practice in martial arts, sometimes you need a really firm focus. Other times you need a really open, supportive holding space. And so how do anybody listening as a leader, expand your repertoire to be able to move effectively and agilely and adaptively? That's really the call for a new kind of leader, is to not be so attached to, this is the way you're supposed to lead. It's like,
Yeah.
well, is it? I mean, there's a lot of people, a lot of different situations. So I think having the capacity to include, like you're saying, everybody, but it starts here at home, then we can start to move out and get work done with and through our team and support them and celebrate them, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I want to just dig into one more thing here,
Okay.
as we're wrapping up,
Mm-hmm.
and that is there a downside to the pause? Is there anything that can get in my way if I'm pausing or I'm not pausing correctly, or is there any downside?
I don't think so. I
Doesn't
think
make
if
you weak, doesn't make you
Oh, not
small.
at all. No, it actually means you're being thoughtful. So
Okay,
it's definitely not weak. You might not think you have time, but if you're breathing here with me, you have time to just take a moment like this.
right now.
That's a pause. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to take up a mindfulness practice, although I highly recommend it. We can practice 20 to 30-second pauses throughout the day, just to kind of reorient and reset our nervous system. So
Yes.
often I will go from my desk when I'm working, and I'll get up and I'll move across the room and I'll pause right before I open the door. So like a momentary pause like that. What that does is it sends a message in the brain that we can reset.
Yeah.
That simple reset is the way to go. So no, it doesn't make us weak. It doesn't mean we have to slow down in terms of the constancy of executing on work. It doesn't mean that you don't know what you're doing. It actually means you're collecting your thoughts or your wits about you or your energy. So no, there's really no downside at all. Mhm.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to make sure that we address that specifically, right? Because
Mhm.
sometimes, we can get carried away talking about all the benefits and sugarcoat or
Yeah,
overlook
yeah.
any negatives.
Mhm.
And so I just wanted to make sure that we were,
Yeah,
transparent about that.
for sure. For
And
sure.
yeah, so thank you so
Mhm.
much.
You're
The
welcome.
other thing that I just wanted to make sure I commented on was the
Yeah.
stakeholder orientation, right? When you're
Oh,
talking about
sure.
how are
Mhm.
all of the people in my business, not just my clients or my customers,
Mhm.
but how are my internal stakeholders and then external stakeholders? Who are the vendors that I'm working with? Who's the
Mhm.
community that I'm engaging with?
Yeah.
And I know that this is one of our pillars of conscious capitalism, and
Mhm.
I hear you connect that kind of orientation with this new kind of leader.
Oh, definitely. Um, definitely. So the old way of business is all about shareholder value, creating that. Nothing wrong with that, but not to the exclusion of others. So the stakeholder orientation is ultimately creating a win-win-win all the way around by noticing who actually has skin in this particular game. My employers, my employees, the vendors, the community, my family. There are lots of different potential stakeholders. And if we can hold them all in mind, we have to make trade-offs, but we want to do so with awareness. And then, like, how do we actually create a win-win, which might mean that we need a little bit longer conversation. This might take a little while to get to, but if we hold that we can be present and well regulated, and I have a comment about that, then, we're smart enough, we can figure it out, right? So
Definitely.
Dan Siegel, you probably know him, Mary. Dan Siegel's a psychiatrist who does lots of work with kids and families and all kinds of people. Everybody should know about Dan's work. He's the kind of guy you want to have a cup of coffee with. But one of the great quotes he talks about is the best gift you can give a child, and I would say an employee or colleague or family members, is to have a well-regulated nervous system. Because when we have a well-regulated nervous system, we're clear-headed, we can make good decisions, our energy is right in, we have the capacity to be open and more empathic with one another. So well-regulated nervous system is great for business, not just for feeling fabulous. It's great for business. Mm-hmm.
I think that's a lovely place to close. Were there any loops that we left open, or any other points that you wanted to bring up before we wrap up?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's been a delightful conversation. Thank you so much. And there's so much about being aware and intentional and cultivating our own leadership that can start with simple pause that I don't think there's any more to add right now. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. And so I would just like to close then with a reminder, right? As we've talked about today, this is something you can't leverage out. This nervous system, you can't leverage that out to someone else. How you're feeling inside, you can't leverage that out to someone else. So you've got to do it, but you also can't do it alone.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Your loop is your loop. And until someone else can show you another way of thinking, that's all you're left with. So you can't do this alone. Call somebody. Call Chris. Call me.
Absolutely.
Call somebody, and we can help you get connected. Right,
sure.
to the resources that you need that would be best aligned for you. So, Chris, thank you again. We will have is the best link to LinkedIn or your website or both? How would you like people to reach you?
Yeah, you can certainly check me out over on LinkedIn, Chris L. Johnson. You can do that. And you could also check me out on my website, q4-consulting.com. And if any of you are interested in conscious capitalism, which Mary and I are deeply committed and passionate about because we think it can make a huge impact in the world, you could check out consciouscapitalismchicago.org. And we'd love to hear from you.